Alright guys, what's up? So you might notice it's currently a little bit dark here, and that's because I am up past midnight. It is currently 8 hours into collating all the Mobalytics stats, and we're finally done. We have gone through, we've updated every single deck, and it's time to do our first Meta Mondays of the new expansion. People have been asking me for 3 days when, I'm going to update the website, when I'm going to update all of the decks on the site, and I wanted to do it a little bit sooner. I really did, but I had to wait for the full Mobalytics stats to come in. There was delays on their end in terms of collecting data because so many more people are playing Legends of Runeterra after this expansion that they actually had to change their data gathering system because it couldn't handle the volume. And you guys know I like being super thorough with all of these updates and all of these decks. I like having as much of a sample size as possible, so I had to wait for that to be finished in order to do the update. As always, if you guys want to check out any of these decks for yourself, there's the link in the pinned comment under the video, and that'll take you to the site where you have access to any of these decks. You can click on the Mobalytics links and import the decks. I'm not monetizing the site, there's not ads. I just made this as a resource for you guys to have access to good decks. I'm also updating all of these decks every day or two at most, so you can check back for more updated versions for ones that, you've already been playing around with. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so going over the tier 1 and tier 2 decks. Keep in mind, tier 1 is 56 or higher % win rate at high ranks in general. So Fizz TF, of course, being the top of the charts. You guys all know Fizz TF. This is considered the best deck in the game, considered by many top players to be tier 0, and I would definitely agree with that. And stress testing, of course, being kind of like the latest, breakout of this deck. Twisted Fate is the core of the deck. We're leveling Twisted Fate very fast by using pick a card, rummaging away stress testing, and then we're winning the game with elusives using iterative improvement on Burblefish. It's a pretty standard deck. It has a lot of complex decisions, but for the most part, it's incredibly powerful and very difficult to effectively counter, so you're going to do extremely well into most matchups in general. Next up, we have Fiora Shen, a classic powerhouse archetype. This is just quintessential mid-range, and it's doing extremely well after the expansion. Continues to be just one of the most dominating decks in the game. Now, this deck hasn't gone through many changes. For the most part, you have the same game plan. You are playing valuable units that are really hard to remove, generally units that stick to the board very well, have pretty tanky stat lines or a lot of protection for them, with River Shaper and Fiora on turn 3, usually into Shen on turn 4, or starting to spam your protection spells at that point in the game, and you just end up trading down the board, keeping your units alive until you blow out with one of your finishers. In this case, Golden Aegis, the new card, is a really big improvement to Rally. We can run 2 of this card because, of course, it gives barrier, giving it a really nice floor for value. So it's actually a pretty sweet improvement to Fiora Shen, already a tier 1 staple. If you guys have been following like ladder meta for the last 4 months, Fiora Shen has been one of just the most enduring mainstays. Because of the bulky nature of Demacia units, especially combined with Deny, this deck tends to be a really effective counter against control Shadow Isles style decks. Usually this means Lissandra control, also anything running like, Thresh Nasus or, some of the P&Z versions. And to round out tier 1 for now, we've got Drac Lorn control. Now, this is actually a really interesting deck. Currently, there are a ton of different versions of Lissandra Trundle being ran. There's versions that are just going all in on Ledros. There's versions that are trying to go really heavy during the, for the Watcher strategy with Spectral Matron. But this version I actually think is extremely good right now, and it's going to be a little bit surprising. We're running 3 Frozen Thralls, 3 Drac Lorn Inquisitors, and a much heavier, kind of like almost mid-range style strategy with 3 Sisters and Troll Chant. So it's almost like it's got elements of control and elements of just mid-range bulk, and we are going to be smashing through the end of the game with a lot of these overwhelms, including some of just the value tools that we have Rekindler and It That's Theirs as bombs. Now, the reason why the Frozen Thrall version is performing best on stats right now, as well as the reason I like this version right now, is because this more mid-range geared version tends to be very good into the kind of like the typical mirror where players are playing the more control-y approach. They have a really hard time actually dealing with the effective value tools that are the Frozen Thralls and the Draculorn Inquisitor when you are getting the 8/8 overwhelms. You're coming online just before their power spike, just before their Watcher is going off, and there's just kind of no effective counter against this. It's super cheap for what it does, and it's a really, really good effective tech tool for this control-y mirror when two Lissandra Trundle players meet. The one with the 1 mana 8/8 overwhelms is just going to be much more favored. And in addition to that, we are also running Three Sisters. Three Sisters is a card that I have begun to really, really like, actually. It is incredibly flexible. The fact that you can use it as a combat trick, the fact that you can use it as an entomb, as a counter towards, you know, certain things like atrocity. There are just so many different ways to use it. Entomb just disabling a unit for 2 turns is very powerful. There will be some cases where you can even entomb one of their powerful units and kill it with It That Stares, which obliterates landmarks. Overall, there's still a lot of experimentation done on the best way to optimize this new kind of like Lissandra Trundle archetype. There are many different ways to play it, but I think this is the best performing way right now, and I think it's got a very good shot of continuing to stay that way moving forward, so I'd recommend this version to everyone. And that's going to go ahead and conclude Tier 1 for now. We'll see exactly how the stats shape up over the next week. There will probably be some more additions to Tier 1, a couple of things coming up, but until then, we've got a pretty diverse Tier 2. There's a lot of new decks, and this is where most of the Shurima decks are landing right now. Shurima, a pretty powerful region. It's got a lot of options, but it still doesn't really have anything that has yet begun to really compete with the old powerhouses. So kicking off the top of Tier 2, we have a couple of aggro decks. We've got Pirate Aggro. This is one of the decks that existed pre-expansion, and it's still very good. This is a very basic classic aggro deck. There's actually not even that much to say about this one. You kill them fast by playing a bunch of cheap units and then attacking the opponent's Nexus. When you get into the late game, you transition into burn spells in Noxian Fervor and Decimate, and elusives in Zap and Lounging Lizard. If you want to play this out, a couple of bonus points towards trying to maybe trigger Gangplank levels. That's going to do well in a lot of matchups where Gangplank flipping ends up being part of your win condition. The other aggro deck is Discard Aggro, another old deck performing extremely well right now. And of course, you know, we expect aggro to do decently well on the stats for the first day of the patch, but Discard Aggro has maintained its win rate pretty well. Now, we're going to see if Discard Aggro takes a little bit of a dip as the Trundle Lissandra decks get more refined and get a little bit more popular, because Discard Aggro tends to be an aggro deck that is so fast and so explosive, it is good at beating aggro mirrors, but it tends to be a little bit more vulnerable towards the control sweepers that we might be seeing more of. So Discard Aggro might be on its way down a little bit. But on Discard Aggro, this deck is actually a little bit more complex than the Pirate Burn deck. We are trying to swarm and go wide so that we can combo with discarding Vision or buffing Crowd Favorite, putting on early aggression, and usually when our board or when our Crowd Favorite is dealt with, we pivot into trying to level up the Jinx or use Augmented Experimenter, burning a couple spells at face with Get Excited, and in this case we've got 1 survival skills as a really cheeky blowout if the opponent goes in to try to kill one of our units and we discard it. That is usually outright game winning. And then we can get into the first Shurima deck so far, which is Leblanc Sivir. So Leblanc Sivir is using Leblanc and it's using Sivir, and basically the idea is, you know, we are triggering Reputation. We have to use Dunekeeper and House Spider to stay alive. In this case, I'm running 2 Rockhopper and 1 Trifarian Glory Seeker. Rockhopper is a great way to be able to, you know, give something vulnerable and capitalize on these quick attack units, whereas the one of Trifarian Glory Seeker is actually going to be really nice for being able to be an early grab option and just kind of balance out our ratios. Bakai Sandspinner is actually surprisingly decent. This is a card that I really underrated, and it really comes into its own in an archetype like this, where you can really capitalize on enemies being vulnerable by attacking them with Quick Attack. Quick Attack is an incredible ability to utilize this vulnerable keyword, as well as, of course, just being an additional 5 attack unit. It's great as well. You can think of it sort of like Renekton. You know, Renekton has this synergy where he wants to challenge things. He wants enemies to be vulnerable. And a lot of the quick attack units kind of work basically the same way, right? Like Sivir doesn't explicitly say I gain a benefit when I challenge a vulnerable enemy, but a lot of how we want to use Sivir and a lot of how we want to use a lot of these new quick attack units is off the back of this vulnerable synergy. We are using 3 Bloody Business as one of the most core cards in this list. This is almost the reason to be in this archetype alongside Whispered Words. The ability to have a kind of mid to late game 2 mana draw 2 is incredibly powerful, and Bloody Business's ability to just be effectively a discounted concerted strike almost for most intents and purposes is really great. In this deck in particular, Bloody Business shines because we are using it on Sivir and Ruin Runner in most cases, units that have Spell Shield naturally, which means Bloody Business is really, really difficult to disrupt, making it pretty nuts. And in this case, I'm running a few copies of Ancient Preparations. These are going to be helping make sure that the Shapestone is going to be executing reliably. We're always going to have the Landmark. And the the Predict is going to help make sure that we are fixing slightly awkward hands and getting early curves exactly as we want. Overall, it's a really cool deck. This is one of my favorite decks of the new expansion. It's a deck that truly feels, you know, pretty unique compared to a lot of other slot-ins. We haven't really seen anything like this before, so very cool. I'm glad Leblanc is actually, you know, finding a real home as a champion, because honestly, the ability to just make sure we're empowering Bloody Business and Whispered Words is value enough, and there's nothing else that really fulfills that role as well as her here. So for anyone interested in trying it, keep in mind this is a mid-range deck, right? Even though it looks a little bit aggressive, mid-range is a lot more flexible and a lot more kind of like medium speed. What that means is there will be some games and some hands where you'll want to play pretty aggressive. You'll have, you know, strong fast openings like Leblanc, like good curves that you can maybe rush the opponent down. But this deck is actually surprisingly resilient at going into the late game and outvaluing. You have so much draw with Whispered Words and Preservarium. You've got so much, you know, exchange for value with Bloody Business that you can take decks to late game. You should not be afraid of playing slowly, playing cautiously, and taking a lot of, you know, long-term plays or passes. All totally fine here. All right, another Shurima deck is Predict Aggro. So this is effectively an updated version of my old Bakai Aggro that you guys might remember from the early days deck. We've actually changed a couple of things from Bakai Aggro, and it's playing fairly different. I've slowed it down just a little bit. We still have some pretty explosive starts as we have Ancient Preparations to be able to reliably get the early hand that we want. This will help Cursed Keeper, Ravenous Butcher, or Cursed Keeper Blighted Caretaker combos, but we are not using the Bakai Reaper anymore. It ended up being just a little bit too unreliable. It had some crazy explosive starts, but as the kind of Trundle Lissandra deck started to become a little bit more popular, it started to get a lot more countered by that general approach, and its 2 health didn't really help him against all of the avalanches and Blighted Ravines there. So this version plays a little bit slower, and we're running Ruin Runner, you know, great over the top card. You guys know Ruin Runner. It's just amazing Spell Shield Overwhelm, as well as Nasus for good atrocity targets. Now this deck with a couple of predicts from Ancient Preparations, as well as some of the other cards like, you know, Preservarium and Stalking Shadows, has great draw reliability. So we have good, you know, shots of getting to our atrocity, our couple of Nasuses, our Ruin Runners, and we're going to be using those to close out most games. Shapestone is also a really great combo piece with this. There will be a lot of combos where you can just, you know, Shapestone a Ruin Runner into an Atrocity, and most importantly, being able to Atrocity a Spell Shield target like Ruin Runner is really powerful. In the same exact way as with the Leblanc Sivir deck, using Bloody Business on Ruin Runner, Atrocity is also going to be undisruptible, well, much harder to disrupt, if you use it on a unit with Spell Shield. The two Nasus's end up going pretty far in this deck just because there will be some games that extend quite a bit and you'll need a lot of reach, and it can be helpful when the game happens to be going quite long because you always have, you know, the ability to come back even when your start gets pretty shut down, which does sometimes happen. All right, next up we have Azir Scouts. So this one was actually pretty painstaking to refine. I had to go through so many different versions to find the exact optimal one, and this is my new version of Lucian Azir Scouts. So if you've been playing this archetype, you know I've actually been kind of like modifying a lot as I go. I've tried out Lucian, I've tried out Lucian Quinn, I've tried out only Quinn, I've tried out Remembrance and some of the Desert's Wrath kind of cards, some of the Swarm Protection cards. This is the final version that I'm ending up on now, which is using the Remembrances. Remembrance is an incredibly powerful tool with Lucian Azir because we are triggering so many deaths so quickly that we're going to get such absurdly discounted Remembrance. All it takes is one Emperor Deus and one Azir and a couple of attacks off of a Blinding Assault, and you'll usually have a 0 or a 1 mana Remembrance pretty easily. And keep in mind, Remembrance can pull some powerful tools for this deck. Cards like Radiant Guardian and cards like Great Horn Companion, the Moose, which I use to main deck here, are extremely valuable, and you'll get them quite often off of this. So keep in mind, in the Remembrance version, you're gonna have to plan out your mana. Plan out, you know, when you're going in to decide what to do for your attack, how to sequence, like the Blinding Assault or the Scout attack, to re-summon the Sand Soldiers on that attack. You will need to be planning out and making sure you're triggering enough deaths and you're not spending too much mana so that you can Remembrance after the combat phase of that turn for very, very cheap. And although we've trimmed the quantity of Scouts, the core roster of Scouts still remain, those being the Grizzled Ranger and the Valors from Blinding Assault. These are going to be what's allowing us to trigger the Sand Soldiers twice per turn instead of once per turn, because of course we're getting 2 attacks for our attack turns. And if you haven't played this deck, Cataclysm has a very powerful special interaction with Scout, which is if you use Cataclysm on a Scout unit on a defensive turn, you will rally for free, because Scouts count as a when Scouts attack, they give you an attack token. That's just how it works. So Cataclysm gives you an attack token when your Scouts attack, if you haven't done a Scout attack that turn, which is very, very powerful, and the core reason Cataclysm's in the deck. You can do some just absurd combos with this and the Scouts. Adding the One of Ranger's Resolve, an incredibly important tool against some of the slower matchups, a lot of Whale or Ice Shards that would normally be disrupting your Sand Soldiers. No more, as well as the One of Inspiring Marshal, great for games that are going a little bit later and you need a little bit more damage overall. So in this deck, I like the version running hard these predict tools, 3 Ancient Preparations and 2 Chronomancers in this case, just because this is a deck that wants to be built around this idea of reliability and making sure you're selecting your combo pieces in the early game, planning out these predicts and planning out what you are going to want from these predicts, right? You can think, okay, you know, if I've got Emperor's Deus and Azir and Lucian in my hand, you know, I see a Remembrance, oh, let's take Remembrance. That's really powerful, and being able to predict and fix the missing pieces of your combo that you need is absurdly powerful in an early kind of combo-y strategy like this. Now, I'm going to have to mention this multiple times. I'll say this in like a tips video as well, but Predict has a special interaction that almost nobody notices, which is that there is a button on the right side when you go into Predict that skips your prediction. You can pass, which means if you see 3 things you don't want from Predict, you can just skip the Predict and you'll get a random card on the top instead of a designated one. This is incredibly powerful, and you need to be doing this. If you see 3 things you don't want from your Predict, skip the Predict. It's a big blue button. You can't miss it once you see it. It's actually, honestly, kind of crazy. The UI is so weird. Literally nobody noticed at first. It's kind of crazy. For like 2 or 3 days after the patch, not a single person noticed that there was just this big blue skip button, and I have no idea how. Anyway, next up we have Ashe Leblanc. So Ashe Leblanc is actually, I kind of like to say that this deck is fairly similar to Leblanc Sivir, because they're both kind of mid-range decks geared towards beating other mid-range decks. In this case, we are using freezes, and we're running this new card, Three Sisters, as a way to just reliably generate value. As I said, I've started loving this card more and more. The flexibility of this card is just quite insane. There are so many spots where the opponent's combo just gets completely disrupted by going in for an Entomb. There's so many spots where I just want a Fury of the North to save something from removal. It's just a great flexible tool. But for the deck as a whole, this is a sort of beef deck built around playing a decent amount of 5 attack units. We are using this card Whispered Words, that it's not the biggest deal in the world. We can play this at 4 mana, but when we can reputation it down to 2, even better. So we play a bunch of bulky units, and we are freezing to control the board and making sure we win our exchanges. Our 5 attack units include Leblanc, which is a nice turn 3 drop when we don't have Aphelios and Trapper, which draws us another 5 attack unit, Enraged Yeti, and Avros and Hearthguard and Kato are just nice ways of being able to bulk out our mid-range. One thing that this deck has pretty unique access to is Reckoning and Culling Strike, and that's in part because of its freezes. You can do a lot of combos with freezing a unit with something like, you know, a freeze, Brittle Steel, Iceveil Archer, whatever, and killing it off with Culling Strike will kill almost anything and is really, really effective at getting rid of things that you just want to get off of the board, right? Reckoning will be enabled very commonly off of Leblanc, Yeti, Ashe, Hearthguard, and this can sweep a lot of small boards in mid-game spots. And usually we're going to be closing games out with Ashe. When Ashe levels up, she stops frozen units from blocking, and then we can combine that with our freezes offensively to blow out the game with our big units. Similar to Fiora Shen, we're using our combat tricks to make sure our units are always killing while surviving exchanges. Now, Leblanc is nice in this deck as an additional 3-drop when we don't have Trapper, in part because an extra 5 attack unit is nice, in part because we have great protection for her in the form of Elixir of Iron and Troll Chant, something that Leblanc can definitely use a little bit, but also she just helps push a little bit of early aggression. If the opponent doesn't have a board, they can get really punished, and most importantly, she's just helping you get towards Whispered Words discount. Alright, next up we've got TF Aphelios. TF Aphelios has actually been dropping its win rate from tier 1 status recently, and honestly, the 2 health nerf Aphelios going to a 3-2 instead of a 3-3 actually ended up being a bigger deal than I gave it credit for. It is a deck that has been knocked down to solidly tier 2, and while there are plenty of people trying to mess around with ways of using Aphelios with some of the new cards, Aphelios Kindred style decks and Aphelios Shurima style decks, there has not been too much success in that, so it looks like Aphelios might potentially be a little bit dethroned. We'll see how it shapes out in the meta, but still a very perfectly competitive deck. In this case, we are using Crescendum to pull out Boxtopus. Really powerful interaction because, of course, when Boxtopus gets summoned instead of played, it is a 2-mana 3/4 with Challenger, which is super powerful because it's 2 mana, and Aphelios leveling on his own, if you have the ability to protect him, will win you the game. This deck basically sticks both TF and Aphelios, or one or the other, and if you keep either of these champions alive for more than 2 or 3 turns, you've practically won the game through the sheer amount of value that they're going to be getting you on board. The assumption, of course, being TF flipping, which he will off of pick a card. There's nothing really new with this one. Mostly, you just want to make sure you are stalling out. As Targon does, you are going to be healing. You are going to be kind of shutting down the opponent's game plan. And towards the mid and late game, spamming Gravitum, the stun weapon from Aphelios, as well as, you know, Gold's card. You are just going to be shutting down opponents' attacks in the mid and late game in their entirety. Then we've got Predict Overwhelm. This is an improved Shurima Overwhelm, and as you can see, I've made some pretty spicy changes to it. So overall, I've removed the Battle Fury. We've gone for different combat tricks and kind of like more flexible ones in the form of Three Sisters and the cheaper tools that we're probably going to be comboing a mixture of cheaper tools as opposed to playing the one big bomb Battle Fury, normal Overwhelm finisher. But in this case, we've gotten very, very heavy in the Predict direction. going 3 Ancient Preparations, 3 Aspiring Chronomancer, and 3 Xenotype Researcher. We are also back to Ancient Yetis. We're going to be pulling these on turn 1 quite a bit off of Ancient Preparations, so we'll draw them turn 2, which means they'll be discounted pretty fast, which is amazing. Xenotype will obviously be buffing big overwhelms in our deck, and we can, if we want to, predict into those a little bit later on turns, you know, any like empty slot on a turn where your curve isn't fully, you know, you don't have to spend all your mana. Like for example, on turn 7, if you happen to be playing a Wild's Claw, you can curve that out with an Ancient Preparations. See if you happen to predict into something big, you know, maybe like a big Ruin Runner or something that will help you just exert a little bit more pressure and close out the game on your next attack. So depending on your situation in this deck, you might have to sometimes resist using these predict cards early. Sometimes if you need to use them early, then you should, but sometimes you can save them after the Xenotype if you have Xenotype in your hands. We've got Three Sisters as a great flexible tool. It's just an amazing combat trick. You can use it for Flash Freeze. You can use it for Fury. You've heard me say these. But a really neat thing you can do with Overwhelm is sometimes when the opponent goes in to block your big Overwhelm units, you can even use it for Entomb, because when you remove a blocker from combat and your unit has Overwhelm, you are effectively dealing full damage. So if they block my big Overwhelm with a 5 health unit and I Entomb their 5 health unit after it's designated, I'm dealing the full damage to face, so 5 more damage to face in that case, which is pretty great. And the final spicy thing we added is a couple of Sivers here. Basically, with the Sejuani coming down a little bit on ratios because we have a lot of 6s already with the Alpha Wealthclaw and with the Ancient Yeti, Sivir helps a little bit to stabilize as a 4-mana play, which this deck needed a little bit more of. She will be leveling in this deck. She works pretty well with the vulnerable game plan, and she's really helpful just as more 4-drops. For hand states, for example, when you don't draw Renekton and tend to be very, very weak for Overwhelm, well, suddenly we've got Sivir here to carry a little bit of weight as well. And of course, we have tons of high attack units, so Sivir will be leveling up. I think a lot of people view Sivir's level up as, you know, you want to give her some cool keyword, you want to use Inner Sanctum or Payday and give her some sweet keyword that will transfer to everything. And while you definitely can do that, for the most part, Sivir's level up is best when you just have a deck that can do it quickly and reliably, and a deck that just wants quick attack and spell shield. So we shouldn't feel like we have to give her keywords. When she levels up in this deck, and she will, and when she gives my attack all quick attack and spell shield, that can be incredibly valuable. And next up here, we've got just Fiora. So this is the classic mono Fiora that you might have seen me play on this channel. And it's a great deck. I would recommend it. It's pretty powerful. It is a full all-in strategy, super unique, and you will have to play it like a full control deck, basically. I think that's the biggest mistake people make when playing this deck, is they're just kind of tempted to take first actions. This is much more of a control deck than anything else. So you're hard mulliganing for Entreat or Fiora, you're kicking everything, and you are making sure you're playing Fiora on turn 3, while keeping her alive from everything. So this means a lot of passing, a lot of open passing. Like I said, you're playing this like it's full control. If you're playing Fiora, imagine you're playing like control Shadow Isles. You're open passing every turn. You're waiting for the opponent to make the first commitment before you do anything. Even when you have the attack token, you are often, not always, but often you're open passing anyway and forcing the opponent to spend their mana or doing something or developing some pressure before you commit anything. And you are just making sure that as long as the Fiora can stay on the board and as long as you have the tools and the mana to protect her at any point in time, you are able to win the game. Now, this requires an intense amount of knowledge about, you know, all the different tools the opponent could be running, all the different hand states they could have. For example, you'll need to be aware of, okay, if the opponent has Vengeance, if they're in Shadow Isles, if they're banking enough mana that they'll be at 7 mana next turn, I need to bank enough mana that I'll be at Unyielding Spirit mana next turn, and I can't spend under my 8 Unyielding Spirit mana until they spend under their 7 Vengeance mana. You know, stuff like that. That makes the deck pretty complex. It is, however, however, a very powerful anti-aggro tool that does a really good job at cleaning out most opponents, presuming you are able to play around everything that they could possibly kill your Fiora with. Overall, I love this deck because it's a super unique playstyle. You'll have to be thinking about a lot of things that normal decks would never have to think about, which is really cool, and it's a great different way to play the game if you want to play the deck. Like I said, it's very different, so I'd recommend checking out some gameplay. I'll link in the pinned comment. I'll also put a link to a Fiora gameplay video from a few days ago if you happen to have not seen it. That also will hopefully demonstrate how to play this deck if you were wondering. Also, I've heard a lot of people say if you don't draw Fiora or entry, the deck just can't function. You can't even play the deck. And while that's true, the odds of that happening end up really low. When you punch them in a 40 card deck, you are drawing, if you're full mulliganing, by turn 3 of the game, you are going to go through a total of 11 cards, and if you're searching for 6, you have an 87 roughly % chance of hitting 1 copy. It's actually going to be slightly less than that. It's going to be 86 something because of a quirk with how Runeterra sequences the mulligan, but it's still going to be extremely high odds, and that's just for turn 3 of the game. It ends up getting quite a bit higher when you're happy drawing Fiora on turn 4. So ultimately, at these odds, you're very happy to be able to play a very powerful game plan when you hit it. All right, so enough of the math. We've got one last deck to go through here, which is a Challenger Elites. This is a pretty interesting build that I have been improving with Kuvira since the early forms of, you guys might have seen the kind of like mono build on the site or on the decks for the new expansion, which was running Jarvan. In this case, we are using more of the quick attacks. Actually, vulnerable and quick attack are just such a crazy combo. Again, with Sivir, you're killing things for free, and with Leblanc, and in here, we're actually fitting in Lucian and Senna. So not only are these cards capitalizing a little bit on the vulnerable from the Splashed Exhaust, but they're also great targets for Penitent Squire's Tattered Banner. So effectively, the core of this concept is we are a mono Demacia deck using Bannerman. We are built around giving everything as much challenger as possible, including vulnerable. Vulnerable is just a different type of challenger, of course, because it's just a different way to let our units challenge their units, and we're capitalizing on that. So Penitent Squire will be giving permanent. Tattered Banner is insane, by the way. Tattered Banner gives permanent challenger. It is not a temporary effect to the unit that it's applied to, which is crazy. So you will often have a permanent challenger Lucian, which can sometimes just be like picking off early mid-game units with quick attack. Pretty cute with Lucian and Senna, but often we're using it on Gallant Rider for the free Vanguard Cavalry. It's a great target on Garen. When Garen has challenger, his regen starts going insane. So in a lot of cases, we'll even want to be saving the Penitent Squire just for use on Garen so that we can give Garen the challenger, but everything is a great target for it in this deck. Everything is going to capitalize very much on exhaust, and like with Fiora Shen, we've even got 2 golden Aegises to be able to close out games with these cheap, effective rallies. Another really nice thing is this one of Grand Plaza. Now the Grand Plaza isn't, now that it's got nerfed, it's not, completely OP anymore. It's a pretty good card, but because it's a landmark, we don't want to double draw it, and it's not the biggest deal ever. It's just nice to have. I'm very happy just having it as a one of in this list. I actually think that there will be a lot of lists that will be kind of sliding in stuff like one of Grand Plaza and one of Scargrounds, like landmarks like those that are just fairly non-committal but good value. People will realize are totally fine to just slide in one ofs into decks without having to build the deck around them in any sort of crazy way, or without having to, run 3 of and just risk having the most bricked hand ever. And with that, that is all of the tier 2 and tier 1 decks that are on the stats right now. So these are all the decks that I would broadly recommend. I'm not going to be going over these tier 3 decks, but just to, kind of have an honorable mention here, Timelines Kindred, a deck that ended up being like really popular in day one. A ton of, high level players and, a large part of like the competitive community. Like there were so many of us like hanging out in the Discord talking about different ways to refine this deck. Everyone loved Kindred Timelines at the start. It's actually fallen off a little bit just in terms of popularity, and its win rate is pretty low at this point, to like 51%, effectively tier 3 win rate. So it might be a little bit more refined later. A lot of people like this deck, and I would not be against recommending it. It's a perfectly fine deck, but it is not one of the kind of best decks to climb with in the game as of now. Kindred ends up being a little bit awkward, really underperforming. Kindred feels really clunky in just so many situations, especially if the opponent is playing around them properly. All right, so that is it for the tier list. If you want to check out any more things, like for example the tier 3 decks, which I'm not going over in this video, some of the definitions here for anything that I'm saying that you might not be familiar with, or any of the kind of descriptions to these decks, you can check it out. Hopefully I have been able to show you guys at least one deck that you're interested in trying out, as well as something that you'll be able to climb with, because I made this resource because I want you guys to be able to learn and to be able to if you feel like you're stuck on a deck, these are great ways to improve whatever archetype you are interested in into something you can climb with. I am very happy that we've kind of like turned this back into an actual tier list. Real quick, kind of like confession for you guys, which is when you guys, for those of you guys who have seen the website in the last week, when there's a new expansion, I do this thing where I make the tier list. I make it all like question marks. Like there's a bunch of experimental decks. There's like the day 1 decks, and I'm updating everything as it goes, but we have no stats. We have no ability to, see exactly how well things are doing and be able to gauge different versions of decks. So a lot of it ends up being pretty, who knows whether this is good or not. And I try to communicate that as best as possible with the fact that everything is tier question mark. And in the video, I try to stress that, the Theorycraft decks are, just that. They're Theorycraft decks. A lot of them were actually doing pretty well. I had the highest win rate decks overall of the early days of the expansion, but I also had a couple of really low ones, and that's what I want to stress with the question marks. And I wish I had like a better way to communicate that. I need to kind of like redesign the site. So, I'm sorry if anyone, if I didn't make it clear enough that they were, like who knows what tier this is, because like I said, well, many of them were very good. A couple of them ended up being duds, and I should have been a little bit more clear, you wait a couple days before crafting resources. So for anyone who ended up, wasting resources, for that I apologize, because I didn't make that very clear in my new decks for the new expansion video. All right, guys, that is it for this. We have fully done the meta update. These are currently the best performing decks in the game, and I'll see you guys next time.